Hello, and welcome to week 12 of the tabletop role playing class. We are spending one last week asking questions of the tabletop role playing games that students have adopted. Today was a really interesting question. Did your game win any awards? And if that game didn't win awards, what did that year? So, students were asked before class to come having looked at their game and their game's kind of advertising and materials to see what awards it kind of shows off on the box or the book. In addition, they're also asked to look into the awards, including Origins, the Diana Jones Award, the Ennies, the NDRPG Award, depending on the year, the BAMFCs, a superhero award, the Nebulas. Some role playing games have won Nebulas. Indiecade, the crits, and the award. Um, and so the idea being that if a game has won awards, that's probably going to be pretty obvious. But what won't be quite as obvious is what was the kind of context in which that award was won, or that award wasn't won at all. And so we spent our time in class together, taking a look at the state of play of tabletop awards. And we started by looking at a kind of Google spreadsheet that I've been working on, just focused on the one category related to actual play, which we'll be discussing on Thursday, at the Ennies, Best Podcast. It's only existed since, well, actually, since I started at Auburn, fittingly enough. And so there's a finite number of times, 15 if you want to be precise, that the award has been given out, gold, silver, as well as honorable mentions and other nominees. I've been collecting that data and aggregating it in different kinds of ways, which I was able to show them. In other words, to show my own work and show how you would start to basically pivot table it up and figure out not only how many times has a given show won an award, but also how many times were they nominated before that, and during that period? What are the most nominated shows? And what are the shows that are kind of, the perpetual runners up? How many times does a show need to be nominated before it might win the big award? All of these kinds of things you can kind of start to parse from data. The other thing that we can start to do that I haven't yet done is code those shows for what systems they're covering, what kind of podcast, which is, of course, an enormous headache when it comes to the really capacious category of best podcast at the Ennies, which led to an interesting question that I posed. I tend to think of a podcast as specifically the born audio form of content. It's the thing that I catch in my podcatcher. It is distinct from what I watch on YouTube or on Twitch. It is designed for my ears, not to my students. My students report that they use podcast capaciously in the same way that, honestly, Wikipedia does, which is to say that podcasts also exist for them as a visual form. Their example was the Joe Rogan experience, which does indeed push out content, very not interestingly designed visual content, but nevertheless, video content of the conversation that also is delivered audio only. And so, this is an interesting discussion that I think we're going to get into more when we talk about actual play and the ways that actual play is created on Thursday, which is podcast is this a massive category. It's not used in the same way by different people, and yet it's the only category of its kind that includes all kinds of different expressions in both video and audio, and often existing in both, everything from interview and advice material to actual plays of all kinds, and a whole bunch of content in between. One category of one of the most significant awards in tabletop. What a mess. And it's also, by the by, an award that's been won by one show a third of the time that it has been awarded, which also leads to the question of, is that a problem? In the Emmys, that's not actually an issue. There's no ceiling on how many times a television show can win an award as long as it's still on the air and producing new content. On the other hand, the Oscars has a very specific window for a theatrical release and how it relates to the awards cycle. Different choices for different media. And so we transitioned into thinking about larger tabletop kind of worlds from that kind of micro example to think about different categories. And we looked at the kind of very capacious categories for the crits, which blow out kind of the notion of podcast or actual play or all those sorts of things into many different categories. And we also talked about so we talked about that, and we talked about who's defining these categories, who's defining what each of these categories means and signifies. Are there rules? Are there rubrics? What makes for a good DM? What makes for a good one shot? Who's deciding? Are we making rules? And the answer, of course, for most of these awards is no, we're making aesthetic judgments that are kind of in the moment comparatively, but not according to any uh, articulated, specific, agreed upon rules or regulations. And that's a trade off, right? Everything we talked about today was about trade offs. There's a certain kind of authority that comes from expertise, from expert opinion. And students were talking very intensely about, okay, so who counts as an expert? Is it a game designer? Is it someone who's played games for 20 years? And we looked to, say, the Ennies judge bios to show how that authority is constructed in different kinds of ways. We looked at the CEO of the Crit Awards, Ivy's bio, in a similar kind of way to show the way that nerd authority and then performance authority and kind of activity in this space kind of flows throughout that document. And this is complicated because professional and amateur, as we're going to talk about more on Thursday, are really not useful categories for so much of TTRPG. It's a mess, right? So, we talked about the ways in which you can create a kind of stable of judges, and we used examples from other media to think about this, right? So for example, the Oscars are notoriously hidebound. You can predict them because the Academy itself is a very overly kind of skewed to particular demographics collection of authorities, especially when you're talking about particular overall categories, as opposed to something like technical awards. On the other hand, People's Choice Awards have at one kind of break away from the kind of ossification of a kind of gatekeeping that comes from having something like an academy, but loses authority from expertise. On the other hand, one could argue, and we discussed this, that the law of large numbers, it means that if you get enough people voting, that you will get a tenor of a community's perspective. This is all really challenging. And one of the things that we talked about is, how do you even make decisions? Books are long, actual plays are longer. How do we suss out and even take a close look? The podcast category in the Ennies is notoriously a 15-minute sample, which means either you're already familiar with the work and thus you've got a leg up, there's a certain amount of name recognition in play, or you're somehow able to capture through very careful and time consuming editing the essence of your show in a 15-minute submission. None of those are without labor costs. None of those are simple or easy to do. And so this is the trick with any award, is how do you balance the different labor needs both on the side of assessing and evaluating as well as submitting. To make a choice to be more free on one is conversely to uh, ensure that the other half is going to have a really hard time doing work. For example, if the New Jersey Web Fest had asked everybody to watch an entire campaign of every actual play that was submitted, you'd have to pay the judges a whole lot more than, honestly, the $5 that we get. On the other hand, we're asking people who submit to the fest to do hours of editing work in order to submit. So even if they get a scholarship to not have to pay the submission fee, they are investing their time and labor into crafting their submission. This is tricky. So we talked about these kinds of things. We talked about the rubrics that aren't there for any of these things. And then we talked about why awards matter. Why is anybody doing any of this? Why are people really excited to win an award? Why do people put award winning game designer on their bios? Because it can matter, right? We have been talking for the entire semester about the idea of a field of cultural production coming into being. And the ways that it does that is by establishing standards that the collective, the field, the community, the industry decide are more important, or at least equivalently important, to the concerns of, say, commercial value. And awards do this kind of function. In theory, awards are designed to s- give us other metrics for valuing things. It's hard when they're kind of unclear in that way. Very many of them are kind of black boxes where it's not entirely clear how the decision was made, which is not to say that any individual award winner is somehow not legitimate, just that the system is really hinky and it's hard to understand and it's hard to know how any given decision was made. And because so many awards do indeed connect to community voting, it's hard to think about these as other than popularity contests. This is the challenge that every new award has to face. Are you going to create a cabal of judges that you think can be impartial in some way, but yet immersed enough and informed enough in the community that they, can somehow forget all of the biases and alliances that they have while looking at the submissions for the given year with an informed and expert eye? Those are messy choices. Or are you going to leave it to the people and run the risk that basically there'll be for your consideration campaigns or popularity contests cropping up everywhere? That's a mess too. There's no great choice, or at least there's not one that we landed on, but we did take a look at each of the different attempts to focus on something different and distinct, and that together, maybe they're doing something that's greater than any individual award can do. Hard to say. One of the things that we didn't get to today, but that I will almost inevitably bringing up on Thursday, is the ways in which many of these awards explicitly do not want the biggest, especially with actual play, players in the scene. The sense is that the commercial success and the enormous scale and scope and impact of something like Critical Role or Dimension 20 is enough. And so many of these awards are trying to create recognition for that which is underappreciated. The trick is, where's the line? Um, what is the group that Critical Role and Dimension 20 belong to that no other actual plays do? Or do other actual plays belong to that group? I'm not entirely sure. This is something that I'm thinking a lot about, especially along with indie and all of this other thing, because this is the stuff of the ways that we understand what's canon. Every single one of the games that my students had adopted had won an award, and they'd gotten onto my master list because someone had recommended them or I'd thought about them myself. Awards have an impact because they raise the visibility and the respect of the object and allow them to circulate farther. They become, in a sense, the initial start of canonization, which is then kind of perpetuated by classes like mine that have to make choices about what are we going to play and assign in the limited amount of time we've got. And while I compensated by having a list of hundreds of games for students to choose from, it was still a bounded space in the thousands of games that exist, and it all had to come from someone else being aware. This is all really, really tricky, but it's a really good example of the ways that cultural production and canonization kind of flow and how power flows. And that there are really, and it explains very easily why something can be good, but not renowned, and that those two are separately. This is not to slam things that are commercially successful by any stretch of the imagination. That we're trying to imagine lots of different ways of valuing the stuff that we're taking a look at. So, yeah, so that's basically what we did today as we were kind of tumbling over the challenge of awards. And I, of course, as I reminded them, am not outside of the system looking in. I'm in the middle of it. To the extent that web fests give out awards, I'm stuck in it too. I'm also implicated by the flows of power. I have a certain amount of authority. I didn't, for the record, vote in any other awards this year. I didn't feel like I was informed enough. And I don't know whether that what that says about me. Um, I don't know. But it was a very good conversation and one that was really, I think, useful for us to grapple with as we have encountered enough games to kind of have a lot of things in our reference set, as well as having already talked to a couple of different kinds of stakeholders in the space. And I think it's also useful because it was a really good exercise in thinking about the ways in which looking kind of at a broad spectrum to look at patterns can be really useful. And that was basically what all of my silly little spreadsheets are about. It's about taking the information that we've got and adding interpretive tags or controlled vocabulary. In other words, how many of the new crit awards are tied to a system versus being system agnostic? How many things are labeled indie? What is indie being defined as? And to look at patterns in those kinds of ways. Allows us, once we do it kind of across a number of awards and a number of years, to maybe see change over time, possibly to see kind of what we intuitively think of as the kind of changing fashions of different sorts of ideas around what games are, and ultimately, in the fullness of time, what podcasts are and actual plays. So the purpose of this day, as I emphasize to students, and I'm emphasizing to my students who are not here for this particular class session, is that this isn't just stuff that we think about when we think about tabletop games. We think about this across all culture. We think about this in academia itself because we also are a field of cultural production that uses things like awards to signify quality. We don't always think about it that way, but that's absolutely what happens. I used to be, as I told my students, a judge for undergraduate like graduation awards, which are fascinating documents that do have very specific kinds of criteria and then random criteria like of good moral character, which I'm not sure to this day how to actually judge. Um, and I don't particularly want to know because I don't think that goes anywhere good. But the key is we are constantly being asked to think about awards as signifiers of merit, even as we are always a little bit aware of the ways in which anytime we're trying to do evaluation, it's kind of inherently fraught in some kind of way. And I reminded my creative writers that this is also true of literary studies. There's been large scale, just down the road at Emory, studies of the awards over the last half century. Utilitarian nature of awards kind of fizzles. which is not to say that we throw out awards, precisely because, in their best ways, awards imagine something different. So, barring questions in chat, that's what we did today in class. Coming up on Thursday, we'll be taking a look at actual play, and students have been asked the prompt: Has your game been performed? Can it? And should it? Students have been asked to bring at least one clip or post it to our discussion board to class, of things we can kind of pop in on. Time marks ideal. And I may or may not create a separate little playlist of students' suggestions for their very different games. And of course, as we've already talked about when we talked about Alice is Missing, actual plays are not always easy to adapt into a performed style. And so some of their games may not have any actual plays at all, or maybe so new that they, or so old that they don't have actual plays. Actual plays are now a major part of the kind of education of new players, but that's a fairly recent development, as all actual play really is in the history of the form. It is a note, and I'll just put this at the end as we're kind of saying goodbye again, unless there are questions in chat, is speaking of Alice is Missing, last night Pixel Circus aired a pre-recorded and edited experiment in what can only be described as a LARP that seems deeply inspired indeed by Alice is Missing, including kind of final recordings of cell phone addressees to a figure who is not seen until the end. I'm still thinking about that actual play as a kind of fascinating experiment in camera angles and editing techniques, as well as what it means to perform actual play in a physical space as opposed to a set, um, where there is no camera kind of at the kind of human level in those sorts of ways. I'm thinking a lot also about the ways in which tables uh, impact actual play in so many ways. And so moving away from the table uh, in and changing the kind of uh, cinematography and the language is really challenging and interesting. It's been done before, for those of you who are not familiar. Um, Many of the performers last night had also participated in Kolak's Council of the Gods, and before that, the city council meeting that they did for Kolak 1991. Recommend both of them as fascinating experiments in LARP, um, as staged in kind of one shot form. And so I'm curious to see this kind of um, distinction, very in very different kinds of hands of different creators, creative teams, and for different kinds of purposes. And let's be honest, with very different access to technology, and abilities to do things, which I think is quite interesting. That's all to say as a kind of final. This is when I was recording this, and this is on my mind. Kind of note as we transition into something that we've talked about or talked around a lot as we've kind of done this semester, but haven't really dived into, which is a weird thing to say in a semester where Gabe Hicks, um, Jason Simon, Ned Donovan, and Matt Mercer have already been in the class, to say, oh, yeah, we haven't really talked about actual play very much. We haven't, honestly. And so here it comes on appropriately on Thursday. And I will see you then. Uh, have a wonderful rest of your day and happy Halloween, y'all.